And so, thanks, Jen. I was just about
Sorry.
no, I was just about to remind myself to remind you. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jordan Day. I, on my normal day, am the policy director for the league, but after Brian Daniel's departure, I have been serving as the interim director. And I think we're now on 4 months, maybe almost 5. So you may have received several emails from me or have heard from me in the past. And so I'm excited to just be working with you on all of this today. So we're doing a quick presentation, Lobbying 101, representing the municipal voice at the General Assembly, presented by me. Sorry, just 1 second. A quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll be talking about the importance of legislative advocacy. We'll also be talking about the General Assembly itself and what that process is like. We'll talk about the importance and how you do legislative tracking in addition to legislative advocacy. So there's a large number of bills in the General Assembly introduced every year. Last year, there were over 2,500 bills introduced, with the league tracking over 750. At this point in the year, we're already tracking about 400 different pieces of legislation that have a variety of municipal impacts. That also includes local legislation. While we don't weigh in on them, we do track them so that they show up in our reports, so that municipal members can engage on local issues. It's important that we have experts here at the league like myself, and we also have municipal experts talking about the municipal impacts, because from a high level of policy, I can say what the broad impact across 39 communities is, but I need your help as experts to help define what those actual tangible results could be. So what that financial impact would be, what the implication is if we change a process that it seems like a simple change, but really isn't. And so that's where you all come in as subject matter experts in your municipal field to help me boost our story and boost the reason why we're weighing in on those particular topics. The General Assembly is made up of 2 chambers. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House really focuses on the budget. It's 75 members. It's the House of Representatives, so it's broken down by population. Senate, we have 38 members. Their advice and consent is led by the Senate President. Pretty self-explanatory. The legislative session runs on a similar timeline every year. Those of you who may have only been doing this during the pandemic have experienced a very different experience. So the last 2-3 years have been quite different. There's been a mix of hybrid or virtual testimony that you may have given, or you've maybe been able to testify over the phone. That was not common until March of 2020. So where we are now in this legislative session is very similar to pre-pandemic operations at the State House. The General Assembly convenes on the first Tuesday of January. This year, they began with wrapping up business from last session and then closing out that session to begin new business of this session. The governor's budget, as you all have already seen, was presented on the 3rd Thursday of January, except after an election year, if there is a new governor, they try to give them some flexibility. Bills must be introduced by mid to late February, except for local impact only bills. So I see that Kate Michaud is on the line, so I'm going to pick on Warren for a second. If Warren had something that was very specific to them, and they needed a legislative change in order to be able to adapt that, they would be able to introduce that bill at any time as long as it was Warren specific. However, if there was something that applied to all 39 communities, that's something that would need a special introduction of sorts in both chambers. All bills are supposed to have had a hearing before April break, which is in about 2 weeks, so it's consistent with April vacation for school-aged kids. Further, then there's the revenue estimating conference in May. This is important because if we're anticipating more revenue, there's a higher likelihood that there will be additional programs or additional funding allocated. If there's lower revenue than we're anticipating, then that's the high likelihood that newer programs will be cut from the proposed budget. When the budget comes out, it gets voted on from the House Finance Committee. Generally, there's been a lot of conversation between the House and the Senate before that, which demonstrates which priorities are going to be allocated for that funding. You will see that happen in early to mid-June. We anticipate this year that because it's an election year, folks will be moving a little bit faster. So we may see that budget come out as early as late May, but also most likely in late June, just depending on how quickly they're moving. The budget must sit out for a week for people to review and comment on it. And then it can be voted on by the House of Representatives, and then it is sent over to the Senate for their review and approval. Simultaneously to that process, there are lots of bills that the bodies will be considering, and they'll be taking action on those leading up to the last few days of session, which occurs usually in mid to late June. As I mentioned, this is an election year, so there is urgency on their part to get out of session as early as possible so they can focus on their elections. Well, that's not how government should necessarily work. It is the reality of the situation that we're in. And so they have their own reasons for wanting to move things forward. But it also means that for us, we'll know about the state budget and a few other major policy issues sooner rather than later. As I mentioned, this is an election year. There's 2-year terms for the House and Senate. There are 16 House committees and 10 Senate committees. You're able to find all the legislator information on the General Assembly website, which is linked here, and I'll send out a copy of this presentation. But just really quickly to show you what that looks like, here's the main website. You can click on legislation, bill status, text history, etc. You can go and click through all of this, and it'll show you everything that you need to know if you're looking to find any additional information. Further, if you ever need to just contact a legislator, they have contact information on each of the House and Senate pages. So contact information is here, and that lists everyone that you would need to find information on, and the same with the Senate. You can also do the same. If you're not sure who your legislator is, you can click on Find Your Legislator, and that will help put you in the right direction. So just a quick pit stop for you. So we've talked a little bit about what the legislative process looks like. Is anyone here familiar or has testified at the General Assembly previously? You can raise your hand with the little reaction button if you want. I see Kate has. I know Kate has because we talked about it last week. Oh, thank you, Mark. My town manager, administrator folks, you're very familiar with testifying. I know that. And oh, Tracy, it's good to hear that you have as well. Oh, I see Joan as well. So that's good. You guys are kind of familiar with the process. So where things start, we've talked about this already, is that a bill gets introduced. It automatically gets referred to a committee. Once that bill is referred to a committee, it gets scheduled for a hearing. So you may see on any agenda that it's scheduled for hearing or for consideration. For hearing is when they plan on taking public testimony. So as an example, last night I testified on the governor's FY 2023 budget and House Bill 7593 in municipal in House Finance on the legalization of adult use marijuana. Those bills are continuously for hearing, and that way they could get testimony from all interested parties that were able to be there, including written testimony, which you're able to submit via email these days. If they were to have been planning to take a vote, it would have been labeled for consideration, which goes on a special part of the agenda. Once it gets voted out of committee, they send it to the chamber floor. So same process for House or Senate. And the body there votes to approve or deny. They may consider floor amendments, which get posted as they're discussing them to make minor technical changes. Generally, if it's large substantive changes, they may vote to send it back to committee on occasion. What happens now is unusual in so many different ways. So typically, you are not obligated to send a bill across chambers, but Rhode Island does that. So typically what happens is once the House votes on a bill, it gets sent over to the Senate and vice versa. In other states, it's normally if one bill gets introduced in one chamber and it goes through that chamber, it can become law. It does not need any other approvals. For Rhode Island, we do this really complementary system. A lot of that is so that they can all take credit for the work that they're doing. When they do that, though, it does also mean that if it's not a priority for the House, bills can get stuck over there. And same thing with the Senate. If it's not a priority for the Senate, bills can get stuck over there. Once they do make it through both chambers, though, it gets sent to the governor for consideration. The governor, I believe, has 10 days. I'll make sure that I include the correct amount of days, but the governor has about 10 days while they're in session to take action on any bill, whether that's signing it into law, vetoing it, or not signing it at all. He has the ability to do that. The other thing is that because they do mirror each other, often there are companion bills that get introduced in order to mirror the language. So what you want to do is make sure that you're tracking both pieces of legislation. You want to see if there's a specific bill. So I'll use legalization as an example. Last week, Bill 2430, which was Senator Miller's companion to Representative Slater's Bill 7593, those two bills are the exact same bill, the exact same language. And that is something that you want to pay attention to because that means that it has the potential for movement in both chambers. Okay. Before I get into anything too deep, are there any initial questions about anything that we've talked about today? I just want to make sure I'm saying a lot and I'm going pretty fast. All right. No questions, we'll carry on. So we already showed you the General Assembly tracking page, but I want to go back to it for a quick second. Oh, we do have a question in the chat. When is the last day that a local bill can be submitted? So a local bill, I don't think there's technically a deadline. They can be submitted at any time, but I would say if a local bill is submitted in the last 2 weeks of session, it does not have the appropriate amount of time to be properly vetted in order for it to move forward. And that is something that we have heard time and time again from the General Assembly, is just that they want to have it where they have ample time. So my recommendation for all folks is that if you have a local bill that you are looking to move forward, then that should be introduced as soon as humanly possible, preferably before the April break, which is right now, I believe, scheduled for, here, let's take a quick look. This is how I track everything. April break is scheduled for April 18th through the 22nd. So I would definitely make sure that you have everything introduced ahead of that date. So we were talking about the General Assembly webpage. So when you're looking to track bills, there's all these tools here. You can just look for a bill. So I was talking about the Rhode Island Cannabis Act earlier. This is just one example. I looked up the bill. It was introduced, referred to Senate Judiciary. You can see every action that has been taken on the bill thus far. And just as an example of showing you the companion to that, So these are the same bills, different chambers, but they have the same exact purpose. And you can see the tracked actions that have been taken on every single one. Further, when you're on the main page, there's also this tool, the bill tracker. I haven't logged in a long time, so let's see what's going to happen. So, nope. So I'm currently tracking 2 out of 500 bills. These look like old ones. So if I want to add new bills, so I'm going to select all, remove those. Okay. So we'll add a couple bills here. You literally just do the exact same thing that we just did when we did the bill search. So keeping consistency, we're going to look up the Cannabis Act bills. So because I want to keep track of these, I'm going to select both of them. I'm going to subscribe, and then I will receive automatic notifications regarding any of this legislation. And then you can monitor when you get them weekly, daily, hourly, and you can manage all of that. You can also search any bill that ends up here, and you can keep track of it this way. For the league, tracking only 500 bills is not feasible, so we use an alternate tracking system. But if you're trying to keep an eye on certain bills that impact your specific portfolio of work, this is a handy tool in order to stay up to date on what those things are, how those things are going and how they're progressing. So I showed you the bill tracker. We call it a lobbyist's best friend because it does tell you all the actions that are happening. You can search for pretty much anything. There's all the calendars, whether it's the House or Senate floor calendars, the committee calendars, all of that information is located on that main page that I showed you previously. So when you're taking a position, it's important to make sure that you're reading the legislation, you're trying to understand the purpose and what the impact is. So a good example of that is yesterday during House Municipal Government, there was a bill put in that required cities and towns to submit all local ordinances to the state Secretary of State, but they would only become effective once you submit them to the Secretary of State's office. From the first initial reaction I would have to something like that is, doesn't seem too bad, but then when you read deeper into the bill, it says that it does impact the effective date. So I would have concerns that municipalities would lose their authority to implement ordinances on a case-by-case basis based on the needs of their town in order to address them in a timely fashion. So because that's a new mandate, not a request or an enabling piece of legislation, I would submit testimony or talk to other professionals like the Planners Association, maybe the Clerks Association, all these other groups, just to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting and that they are on the same page. And would they also be interested in submitting testimony to go along with what I'm saying? I would prepare written testimony. Some cases we would submit council resolutions if it was a big priority piece of legislation. What we do here for the league is we support with talking points, form letters, and council resolutions. Folks may have experienced or received our advocacy alerts that we've just started doing, which tries to outline what exactly is happening in the bill, what you need to do in order to help take action, and then what some key talking points are, as well as additional tools, whether that be a form letter or it be a council resolution that we would ask that city and town councils move forward on. So we have all those tools in order to make sure that folks are prepared and we can align our positions together. So you may be saying, all right, when do I officially become a lobbyist? Most municipal officials are not required to register as a lobbyist if you're acting in an official capacity or if you're representing a professional organization, only occasionally. I, for example, though, do have to register because I am there frequently. I'm talking on a variety of issues, and I have no specific purpose other than to go to the state to ask them to advocate for meaningful policy changes that impact municipalities. That is my role and my job. Whereas some of you on your normal day-to-day responsibilities, you might be finance directors, you might be town managers or administrators, mayors, you might be your city treasurer, your town treasurer. Those are all things that you may be in your normal professional life, and you are responding to something that would impact your professional duties. If you feel like you need to register, and there are several communities that do register them, their main folks that go to the state house as lobbyists, you can always check out here going to the Secretary of State's website just to see if it's time for you to register for a lobbyist. There are specific regulations which you're able to look at. And like I said, I will share this presentation. But again, most municipal employees are not required to register. There are certain definitions that apply, which provides us some flexibility, but these are the key definitions that we should be paying attention to, especially for municipal officials. So when you're testifying in committee, you've probably already submitted something in a written format. They are the best opportunity to have your voice heard by the legislators, especially those that are in the room. Sometimes you might be having trouble getting a hold of the sponsor, or trying to find the committee chair is a bit of a challenge. I often find that by being at the State House, I'm able to grab folks and say, hey, I noticed that you submitted this bill. This has a negative impact on cities and towns. Do you have a minute for us to talk about that? Yesterday, I saw a committee chair and I said, hey, I wasn't able to get up here last week and testify on this bill. I saw the hearing. It seemed like it was favorable, but this presents a lot of challenges for cities and towns. Should I be concerned? Those are just opportunities for you to engage at a different level. When you go to testify, most hearings are at the rise, which is at the end of the House or Senate floor calendars. So when they're done with their business for the day, they then disperse and go into committees. There's a sign-in sheet at each committee room, and there's one for each bill. You normally need to sign your name if you're representing an organization, your position, and if you're submitting written or verbal, sometimes they do ask for that. Hand in your written testimony to the committee clerk, and then what you want to do when you're giving your testimony is just summarize key points. You don't want to repeat exactly what you've written because they already have it. So typically I start this with, hi, my name is Jordan Day. I'm the interim executive director for the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns. I've submitted written testimony to you that explains my position in detail, but I want to highlight a few priorities that I want to make sure that are brought to your attention. And then I run through those one or two, maybe even three things that I feel are important. It's also an opportunity for you to respond to what you've heard said by other folks in the room, whether it's other people who have testified, folks on the committee, if you've heard a representative or senator say something that you know needs additional clarification. So I started my testimony last night. I said, hi, how are you? My name's Jordan. Thank you so much for having me. I think for obvious reasons, I have to oppose this piece of legislation. This is a different bill. But I did hear some information, and you go through those key points. I did, and then you touch on those things. I did hear Representative so-and-so mention this. I just want to clarify that. And then you further expand on that point in order to give them more and more information. That might be information that you didn't include in your written testimony in the first place, but you want to make sure that they hear. It's also important to potentially be strategic. I find that I like to generally go first if I'm supportive of a bill. I want to get my point out there. I want to get it done, and I want to be clear about my support, why I'm supporting it, and if I'm seeking any amendments, just what those amendments are. You can also be more strategic. especially on certain issues. If there's something that a lot of people are in favor of, but you're vehemently opposed to, you may want to sign in at the end so you can do a cleanup. And that way you're able to make that meaningful and memorable connection and talk about all the things that have already been addressed. It's also important when you're in the room to make a local connection. So you yourself may not have a committee member that's representing you, but you can talk about your community or the impact to your community, because that's a real example. Last night, talking about housing, I referenced a community that would benefit from one of the other bills being considered before that committee, but not the one I was testifying on, and how that one would actually do damage. That was well received by the committee because it was a real-time, real-life example. So you have to also be prepared. You may get questions, an agenda may change, you might be testifying to an empty room. When I testified in municipal government last night, I testified on the bill that was listed first on the agenda, and it wasn't taken until the very end. And on the other hand, I testified in House Finance as well, and there were only 3 people in the room, and it's a committee of more than 10 to 15 people. It's also important that if you have a discussion or somebody mentions that they want to touch base with you afterwards, make sure that you do that follow-up. Or if they ask for additional information, make sure that you get that information to the clerk. It's important and essential that you also do your due diligence at that part. When you're testifying and a bill is scheduled for hearing, most bills are held for further study. It is just a process point in the legislative process where they procedurally hold them for further study so that they can say that they've taken into consideration, may make amendments, may want to make changes, or based on the testimony that they received, may not move forward on that legislation at all. So that's a really good opportunity just to see procedurally where things are heading. Tracy, you asked a great question. Why are the committees not required to have a quorum when hearing oral testimony? So the one thing about the General Assembly is that they themselves are not required to comply with the Open Meetings Act. That is suspended for them. They mirror a lot of those things for themselves. That's also why you generally see that they may hear bills held for further study at the beginning when they have quorum versus at the end. A lot of the reasons why is that they may need to go to other committee hearings that are dealing with other things. They may have their own committee members may have bills that are being heard in other committees that they are trying to testify on themselves. And committees try to provide deference to different folks, especially. So last night, as an example, I was testifying on a bill by Representative Henrys from East Providence. She did not get the deference because her bill had some contentious points, but other committee members, other non-committee members who were there to testify but had other hearings as well, were given that deference. So you do see that often. It is frustrating. I mean, last night when I testified to 3 people, I was like, why the heck am I here? But I remember that it's also important to have my opinion and my voice on record, because what I say does matter. And regardless of how many people in the room, it's important to make sure that your perspective is shared. It can be frustrating, but it's something that you also have to get comfortable with. Unfortunately, it is just kind of the way things work. So after the committee, you may want to reach out to local officials or professional associations. For you all, that might include the league, the clerks association. Sorry, there's a train going by if you heard that. You may want to reach out to the tax assessors, and you may want to regroup after that. So there's a couple of bills last night I may want to connect with folks from the Planners Association with, just to say, hey, this is the testimony. It was pretty well received. How do you guys feel? Is there something else you want to weigh in on? And that's when you decide also how much harder you want to push on those changes. Do you want to decide, are you going to support it as is? Are you going to continue to push for amendments? Can you strictly only oppose this legislation? Or are you going to choose to back off? There were several bills that have municipal impact but are good that I have chosen not to weigh in on because they're minor changes and they allow communities to do something rather than mandate. It's also important that you follow up with your local senators or representatives to explain your position and make sure that they're clear on why you have any concerns or why you're in support of that legislation. If the bill is moving forward, you have to prepare for the moment when the committee is going to vote on it. You're going to want to watch that vote as well as the floor vote. And so you'll have to watch for those floor calendars. So I've gone through a lot of information. I want to allow you all to ask some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I'm happy to go back to anything that I've already gone over. Are there any questions, or does anyone want to share an experience that they've had? It would be helpful to hear from you all how you felt during these times. Seeing no enthusiastic hands up. So several of you have said you testified. Tracy, do you mind telling me about an experience that you had testifying at the State House?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if the microphone worked. Sure. I've gone to the State House many times. You hit some good points as far as, be prepared for an empty room, be prepared for committee members to be coming in and out, be prepared for them to not really understand where you're coming from, because you may be coming at it from a very specific professional aspect that they don't really always understand. Be prepared for the room to be 90 degrees or 20 degrees. Be prepared to be there until 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night.
Right.
Yeah, it's, I've done it many times. My first couple times I was very nervous. And then after that, you realize like, this is par for the course. This is what we do. Yeah, I really, it's unfortunate that we don't have more people in the Clerks Association that are willing to go to the State House. I know it's, it can be very frustrating because there's no set time for start. There's no set time for end. Sometimes it's, you think this bill's being heard first, so you're optimistic about getting out of there and they rearrange it. The only one thing I can say that, I can just put on my wish list that I know is never going to happen is I wish they were subject to open meetings, that they had to, post at least 48 hours in advance what they were going to hear and not be able to change those things around at the last minute and, have a set time and have to have a quorum. If we're all subject to those things, my personal feeling is that they should be too. But, like I said, I can just put that in my wish jar and that's where it'll stay.
I think we all wish that there was a more finite timeline because nobody enjoys just spending I enjoy it, but not everyone enjoys spending a Tuesday night in the State House for 4 to 5 hours, not knowing when that's going to end. So I totally understand that. I did see that you asked a question about whether or not I felt written or oral testimony is stronger. Personally, I think that providing verbal testimony is the way to go, especially if it's something that you have that is a priority. But I think that having written testimony, making sure that your opinions or your concerns are on file is a surefire way to make sure that those like very detailed, specific positions are outlined. Because to your point, Tracy, that you made, is that they're not subject matter experts. Like they all do other things for full-time work. Like not everyone is going to understand the nuance of meeting posting or tax collecting and assessing unless they do it for for work, they don't get it. And I find this very often when it comes to planning. Everyone thinks that they're a planner, except they don't understand the nuances and challenges that comes with process. So one of the things that I feel verbal testimony does that written can't always is that verbal can help elevate it from the operational, tangible, tactical work that you're doing to a policy-based discussion versus just the like operational nuances. So there may be some legislation where you're just like, hey, this is bad process-wise, but you have to explain the why. So yes, the process is bad, but this means that we wouldn't be able to approve housing development for now. And I'm making something up, but like there are real reasons why the process creates challenges, and you have to explain the why. So that's why I use that. Verbal testimony is for the why.
I agree with you 100% on that. I mean, my focus, obviously, being the elections administrator, is election bills. And sometimes I see these election bills and I'm like, well, you know, their heart may be in the right place, but it's just in practicality, this doesn't work. It can't work there. Why? And that's where we have to come in and say, I know what you're trying to accomplish, but the way it's written or the way it's proposed, or because of whatever other factors, it's just not practical. This just can't be done.
Right.
And I think that sometimes that's very frustrating for us as we see this legislation come through and we're like, this doesn't even make any sense. But a lot of times they're just introducing things because they're hearing constituent concerns and they just propose these things. And it's up to us as the professionals to make them understand, why this can't work a certain way or why it can't work at all. I mean, I have a couple of specifics in my head that I'm like, how could you even do that? But that's where either the written testimony or the verbal testimony comes into play, because we have to make them understand that so they don't pass legislation that is, very complicated or sometimes even impossible to enforce.
I agree. And I also think it's important that if you're there testifying on something that could have a negative impact, but you've also been working on, say, a piece of legislation that you want to see elevated on top of something, it's also an opportunity for you to say, hey, this is a problem, but we've actually submitted a piece of legislation that would provide similar relief. This is the bill number, and we prefer seeing that move forward because it addresses X, Y, and Z rather than A, B, C. And as an example, last night I was testifying on a ban on single family zoning, and I said, sure, maybe you double the number of houses or units from 24 to 48 on the street, but how many people is that, and how does that impact the sewer system? And I said, when it comes down to it, we have antiquated systems in Rhode Island, not just Rhode Island, but throughout the country, really. And we need to do something that's not just adding more housing, it's beyond that. It's much bigger than that. And then that's when I said, the league identified a priority to add $30 million to the Municipal Infrastructure Grant Program over a span of 2 years. This would help us start to address some of those issues as we talk about housing development and what that looks like. And the committee members were like, whoa, you asked for that? And they started asking me questions about something that was my priority versus a bill that is impractical and doesn't make sense. So I shifted them to something that we do care about versus something that we are opposed to. And I got them to latch on to something that was a much better idea to support additional housing investments. So it's also a good opportunity to do something like that when you're trying to shift perspective. You're able to also get kind of clever with it and and pick up on little things that they normally wouldn't have the opportunity to hear because maybe you don't have a bill in, maybe it's not in the budget, but you do say that you asked for something or you did do something or you've been advocating for this and you'd like to see that included as well. Any other questions or discussion that folks want to have? Anybody else want to share an experience that they've had at the State House? I don't want to pick on anyone again, but I'll do it. Joan, welcome. You're still, oh, there you go.
I got it. I don't have a video, but
That's okay.
I just find that testifying on the phone was very nerve-wracking. It was very difficult because when you're in the room, you can see the people and you can tailor your discussion, your testimony to their reaction. But doing it on the phone, it was like, it's like you're just looking at a blank wall and testifying. It was very nerve-wracking and frustrating.
I definitely agree. Testifying on the phone was definitely a challenge for me. I do also like that interpersonal interaction. That's why I tend to, or had been making those individual one-off calls or scheduling opportunities to talk to folks about our priorities so that I could develop that personal relationship with them. But I mean, we are now back to only in-person testimony. So anybody who was really wishing for that to happen, your dream has come true. And we will be back in person. I was excited to see a member of the American Planning Association Rhode Island chapter last night testifying. It would be great to have other folks come up and testify because I think that too often our municipal perspective is not emphasized. And I think that it's important that we're tackling our unique experience and talking about that in front of folks because I don't think they hear it enough. They hear a lot of folks that are on the advocacy side saying this is why we need the change. But I mean, one very simple example is they've tried to pass they have a bill before them mandating that all cities and towns would need to provide 24-hour notice on snowstorm and parking bans. That's totally illogical. And I understand how, from a resident's perspective, that makes sense. They don't see the challenge with that. Why not? But there's so many factors that go into decision making for those types of opportunities. And by being there in person yesterday, I was actually able to ask the chair of the committee. I was like, hey, I just want you to know, we have concerns about this. It's not practical to implement. I understand the appeal. If it's moving forward, can you give me a call because we need to work on something that's an alternate solution. This doesn't work. And so I agree that in-person opportunity is so much more valuable than testifying over the phone. Obviously, I think during a pandemic, we had limited choices, and I think that we did what we had to do. Right. I did find that if we ever have to go back to that, my personal tip is that I would mute the screen in front of me just in case they did pan over to committee members so I could pretend that I was talking to someone. It did help. It wasn't perfect though. I also tend to fly by the seat of my pants and try not to use notes so that I'm mostly speaking from the heart. So it's authentic rather than really robotic. So I would just also encourage that if you're writing notes, you write an outline, just quick notes about what you want to talk about. These are my notes from last night. You'll see they're just quick little tidbits about what I wanted to make sure I covered during testimony. And I use them just as a reference. Tracy, I see that you asked a question about any idea why we have a single year session instead of 2-year sessions so that bills don't need to be duplicated in the second year of the term. So technically it is a 2-year session, but they just don't carry over the bills. The House last year instituted a new rule where they could carry over, any representative could select to carry over 3 bills. and they could be carried over into this year. So if you're seeing bills in this session in 2022 labeled with the first number is a 6, or in the 6,000s, I think it's over 6,500. That is a bill from 2021. This year, all their new bills started at 7,000 or 7,001 maybe. So that if members did want to carry over 3 priority pieces, they could still do that. The Senate does not have that rule. Why they do it, I think, is sometimes just a practicality of separating the content and discussion. But I do think that being able to carry the bills over is helpful. And so I think that by instituting that new rule, they've tried to find a compromise. Well, it's not everything. It is something. Any more questions, or anybody else want to share an experience that they've had? I think it's always helpful to hear from other folks about what it's like. And I love hearing bad experiences, because it like if you felt it was bad, not that it actually went bad, because I think like our personal experiences, they're just good learning opportunities. So you never really did anything wrong. You're just going to improve from that moment. So it's okay if it didn't go great from the start. So does anybody have an experience that they want to share? I'm going to try one more time. Okay. Well, Danielle, I see that you've unmuted, but I can't hear you. All right. Danielle, if you're still there, we'd love to hear from you. Does anybody else want to weigh in? Okay. Well, you've all been a great audience. I've had a great time chatting with you. If you need me, I am available. My contact information is on our presentation, but it's simply just jday@rileague.org. I am happy to talk with anyone about a specific experience or just general discussion. I'm happy to be helpful. Feel free to reach out with any questions you might have, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction or help give you some additional tips and tricks. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good one.